Welcome back to Move with the Sky. Before astrology had charts, before it had signs, houses, aspects, or horoscopes, it existed as something much quieter and much older. It existed as observing. Not necessarily belief, not personality theory, but spirituality in a different sense. Astrology begins in a world where the sky was not symbolic or psychological. The sky was operative. It mattered because life depended on it. Crops depended on it. Kings depended on it. That meant survival depended on it. And astrology really begins there, long before anybody asked what their sign was. So we begin around 2000 BCE. In the ancient city-state of Babylon. Located in Mesopotamia, the fertile region between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, in what is now part of modern-day Iraq. In Babylon, the people responsible for observing the sky were priests, but not in the way we usually imagine priests today. These were scholar priests, astronomer priests, or mathematician priests, who were advisors to kings. This meant they didn't work in a shadow or in isolation. They were embedded in governance. Kings did not make decisions without consulting them. And when these priests observed the world, they were not only watching the sky, they read meaning in the flight of birds even. They examined the entrails of sacrificed animals. They watched oil poured into water, how it spread, broke, and how it formed different patterns. And they watched the movement of the stars as well, planets and other heavenly bodies too. This matters because astrology did not emerge alone. It emerged as one branch of a larger worldview. The belief that reality is patterned, responsive, and capable of communication. So nothing was random back then, or isolated. Everything spoke, and if you knew how to listen, well. At this stage, astrology wasn't personal. There were no birth charts. There were no rising signs at this point. There are no horoscopes in the modern sense. In this early astrology, this is what scholars will later call mundane astrology. Basically, astrology concerned with the fate of kingdoms, rulers, wars, droughts, plagues, or even prosperity. The sky was read not for individuals, but for the collective's fate. And crucially, this astrology was recorded. Now, by the 17th century BCE, Babylonian scholars had compiled elaborate tables charting planetary movements. These are the earliest astrological documents we know of. They're not poetic or philosophical, but they are observational. They track where the planets appeared, disappeared, reversed in direction, and even returned. One of the most important of these early records is known as the Venus Tables of Ammisaduqa. These tablets focus entirely on the planet Venus, and that alone tells us something, because they weren't casually observing it. In fact, they tracked its movement almost obsessively. The Venus tablets of Ammisaduqa record Venus appearing as the morning star, then disappearing, reappearing as the evening star, and this was tracked over long periods of time. So this tells us that Babylonian astronomers understood that Venus followed a repeating cycle. Even if they did not yet have the heliocentric model to explain it, they were watching pattern before really being able to explain why. Venus wasn't just a planet, it was associated with the goddess Ishtar, whose worship dates back to at least 2300 BCE. Ishtar was a goddess of love, sex, fertility, war, and power. So Venus was not quote-unquote romantic in the modern sense. Venus was a force. And astrology at this stage is deeply entangled with what scholars call astro-religion, the idea that celestial bodies are divine forces acting in the world. Now, over time, these observations accumulated, not casually, not intuitively, but systematically. This happened across centuries too. Babylonian scholars compiled vast collections of celestial omens. The most famous of these was the Enuma, Anu, and Lil. The Enuma, Anu, and Lil was not just a single book, rather a massive series containing more than 7,000 astrological portents, 7K, each one connecting a specific celestial configuration with a specific outcome, especially concerning kings and empires. So these texts were consulted when deciding whether to go to war, whether a king's reign was threatened, or whether famine or disaster was approaching a civilization. This is astrology as state intelligence. And here is something modern listeners need to understand. These priests were not guessing. By around 500 BCE, Babylonian astronomers had achieved a level of mathematical sophistication unmatched by any other contemporary civilization. They divided the circle into 360 degrees, a system still used in astrology today. They also tracked planetary cycles with remarkable precision. They developed reference systems that allowed them to compare positions over time. But, and this is critical, they did not yet have the zodiac as we know it, okay? So this is astrology, but not what you think when you think of modern astrology. The Babylonians focused on specific stars, not just zodiac signs. They created stellar calendars based on pre-drawn rising of particular stars at different times of the year. The zodiac had not yet been formally identified, so astrology existed, but not yet in the symbolic structure that we recognize it as today. That structure actually comes much later. And now something important begins to happen. Astrology begins to travel. As Babylonian knowledge moves to Egypt, it encounters religious mysticism and temple traditions. As it moves to Greece, it encounters philosophy. Now, this blending of those different, I guess we would call them industries now, but practices or disciplines, the blending of that was called syncretism, the merging of different belief systems into something new. And syncretism is what changed astrology forever. Out of this blending emerged what later scholars called the Hermetic tradition. The central figure of this tradition is Hermes Trismegistus. Hermes Trismegistus is not a historical person in the usual sense. He is rather the fusion of different figures. The Greek god Hermes, which was the messenger of the gods, and the Egyptian god Ptah, associated with wisdom and writing. Through syncretism, these figures of these different belief systems merged into Hermes Trismegistus, often translated as Hermes the Thrice Great. A body of writings grows up around this figure known as the Hermetic texts. Now, these writings integrate Babylonian astronomy, Egyptian spirituality, and Greek philosophy from way back then. Astrology through hermeticism becomes more than prediction. It becomes cosmic language, a way of understanding how divine order expresses itself through time and matter. Now, by the 2nd century BCE, nearly all the foundational elements of astrology are finally in place. Planets, zodiac divisions, angular points, and the idea that the sky at specific moments actually matters. So the word horoscope, as we learned in previous episodes, comes from the Greek, meaning watcher of the hour. Astrology is now anchored to time at this point. So in the next part of this episode, we'll learn how astrology does something revolutionary. It enters the human body. So that's what we're going to tap into next. Astrology had just crossed an invisible threshold. It had moved from watching to remembering, from noticing patterns to recording them. And that shift changes everything. By the time we reach roughly 1000 BCE, Babylonian astronomers are no longer simply observing the sky night by night. They begin organizing it, building systems that allow them to track time, predict reoccurrence, and compare the present sky to skies that occurred long in the past. One of the most important tools they developed during this period is the astronomical tablet. These tablets were often circular diagrams divided by radial spokes into 12 equal arcs. These arcs did not yet represent the zodiac signs. Instead, they represented the different months of the year. Each month was marked by the pre-dawn rising of 3 specific stars. This matters because it shows us something critical. The Babylonians at this point were mastering stellar movement long before they formalized symbolic meaning. These circular star diagrams functioned as early celestial maps. At the center of the disk was the northern point of the sky. Around the edge was the southern horizon, and this allowed astronomers to visualize the yearly passage of the sun against the backdrop of fixed stars. But again, and this is key, the zodiac had not yet been identified. Now, if the zodiac had existed at this time, those constellations would have been used to mark the months, but they weren't. Instead, the Babylonians worked with specific stars, not symbolic signs either. Now, this is one of the most important things I believe to be true for modern astrology students to understand. Astrology didn't begin symbolically, it began mathematically. And now we return again to the planet that was obsessed over the most, Venus. The Venus tablets of Amisa are actually mentioned across multiple historical sources, including later works like A Scheme of Heaven by Alexander Boxer. These tablets are important because they demonstrate long-term astronomical memory. They track Venus as both the morning star and the evening star over extended cycles of time. They also record when Venus disappears, as we mentioned before, but this is important because it allowed Babylonian astronomers to predict Venus's reappearance with remarkable accuracy. Now, why would they want to do that? With the association of Venus connected to the goddess of Ishtar, the goddess who ruled over fertility, sexuality, warfare, sovereignty, and destruction, that meant that, at least in Babylonian astrology, Venus is the power that created and destroyed. Now, that wasn't being sentimental, this was them believing in cosmic force. So, alongside their observation of Venus, this began to allow them to continue expanding their omen literature. Now, here is where we return again to the Enuma, Anu, and Lil, which was that 7,000 containing, or that series of books that contained 7,000 different astrological portents. These were important because they included different earthly outcomes like eclipses, conjunctions, shooting stars, halos around the moon, unusual cloud formations, and even comets, and each one of those omens followed a specific structure. If this appears in the sky, then this occurs on Earth. That was the belief. And it wasn't superstition. This is pattern recognition across time. So they were using real-life moments to measure real-life moments that they thought might occur later. Now, the superstition, the symbolicism, and all of that we associate with the zodiac and everything didn't come until much later in time. Now, here's something more subtle but extremely important. Despite their extraordinary observation skill, the Babylonians didn't really develop a full cosmic model. They didn't conclusively decide whether the heavens were a disk or a sphere yet either. Now, this is one of the most puzzling gaps in Babylonian science because they tracked movement without fully theorizing why it moved the way it did. So that philosophical leap actually comes much later with the Greeks, which I mentioned earlier. But before we go there, we need to talk about the numbers because astrology did emerge as something very and purely mathematical, quantitative, observations and all of that was super important. So, because astrology becomes astrology only when it becomes measurable, it's important to discuss how at some point between the 7th and 5th centuries BCE, a critical innovation happened. The path of the sun is divided into 12 equal sections, and each of those sections span 30 degrees. Together they form a full circle of 360 degrees. This division mirrors Babylonian mathematics, which was based on sexagesimal system, a base 60 counting system, and this is what we still use today. 360 degrees in a circle, 60 minutes in an hour, and 60 seconds in a minute. This is a Babylonian legacy. For the first time, the heavens now have a reference system. Now this is crucial because without that reference, you cannot compare positions. And without that comparison, you can't calculate timing. And without calculating timing, astrology cannot exist as it does today. This very Babylonian system allows astronomers to locate any celestial body using celestial longitude and latitude. It allows them to measure the angular distance between 2 points on the ecliptic, and yes, this is the early groundwork for what we later call aspects. Not yet a symbolic thing, but purely geometrical. Now, astrology is ready for philosophy. As this mathematical astrology moves westward into Greece and syncretism happens, it encounters thinkers who are deeply concerned with meaning. Greek philosophers ask questions the Babylonians didn't really prioritize, like, what is the nature of the cosmos? What is fate? What is human agency? In Greece, planets are increasingly viewed as gods, not just as objects, but living intelligences. This idea appears strongly in the work of Marcus Manilius, a Roman astrologer writing in the 1st century CE. Manilius describes astrology as a reflection of Stoic philosophy, the belief that the universe is ordered, rational, and governed by divine reason. Manilius also introduces something important. He begins describing the qualities of the zodiac signs. So he discusses geometric relationships such as squares, triangles or trines, sextiles, conjunctions, and oppositions, which we will learn about more in depth in later episodes. But at this time, when he introduces these qualities of the zodiac signs, they're not yet called or coined aspects. This is what we use in modern astrology. But the geometry is still there. The sky is no longer just being watched, it's being mapped relationally to other astrological bodies and then compared or predicted to what's going on in Earth using symbolicism and philosophy. So, at the same time, other Hellenistic astrologers also emerge, like Vitius Valens, which we talked about in previous episodes as well. Valens writes extensively on predictive astrology and chart interpretation. Nicepso and Petrosigris are legendary figures associated with Hellenistic astrology, often cited as sources of lost foundational texts. Their names appear repeatedly in later astrological literature. And now we arrive at the Hermetic texts again. But this time, astrology is no longer just cosmic language. It begins touching every part of life. Hermetic writings include unusual works such as the Brontologion, which interprets thunder based on celestial configurations, and the Paraseismon, which interprets earthquakes astrologically. These texts show us something vital. Astrology is now being applied to natural phenomena, weather, earth movement, and disaster even, or natural disaster. So this is not personality astrology yet, but environmental astrology. Now, Hermetic dialogues also explore medicine and healing. Some are framed as conversations between Hermes and Asclepius, the god of healing, who is also believed to have some historical figure, or believed to have been a historical figure. Now, these writings actually discuss planetary influence on health, astrological timing of remedies, and healing through cosmic alignment. This is the time where astrology begins to move decisively into one body. This creates confusion as well, though, because many later scholars mistakenly assume that astrology originated in Egypt, which it did not. The Egyptian setting of the Hermetic texts gave astrology an Egyptian aesthetic, but its technical foundations remain Babylonian and Greek. Now, later during the time period of the European Renaissance, the rediscovery of these Hermetic writings would give astrology a distinctly occult reputation. But that comes much later in time. For now, astrology has completed a transformation from purely being omen reading to mathematics, and then from mathematics to meaning. And in the next part of this episode, we will cross the final threshold where astrology becomes personal. It enters medicine, it enters development, the human lifespan itself. So let's get into it. By the time we arrive here in time, astrology has already lived several lives. It has been an instrument of kings, mathematical discipline, a cosmic language, a system for reading fate at the level of empires. But now something subtle and revolutionary is happening, which I said before, but it's happening in a different way because astrology begins to turn inward. The shift takes place during what scholars call the Hellenistic period. A cultural era begins after the conquests of Alexander the Great in the late 4th century BCE, and this continues for several centuries afterwards. The Hellenistic world stretches across Greece, Egypt, Mesopotamia, and parts of the Near East. This is a world where ideas move more freely. Babylonian astronomy, Egyptian religious symbolism, and Greek philosophy are now in constant conversation, and astrology begins absorbing all of it. One of the most important changes in this period is the emergence of what now is recognized as the horoscope. The word horoscope, as we learned in previous episodes, comes from the Greek word hora, meaning hour, and skopine or scopine, meaning to observe. So a horoscope is quite literally the translation of watching of the hour or watcher of the hour. Now, this is the moment astrology becomes anchored to a specific time, and not just any time, but like the time of someone's birth, for example. For the first time, the positions of the sun, the moon, the known planets are being mapped for one single individual as opposed to an entire empire or civilization's fate. So the sky is no longer being read for those kings and empires, but for people. Now, central to this development is the concept of the Ascendant. The Ascendant is the zodiac sign that was rising on the eastern horizon at the moment of birth. It marks the point where the sky meets the earth, where the cosmos enters the body. And this is why the Ascendant becomes so important to astrology, because it's not symbolic in the abstract. It is geographical. It depends on the specific location and time of the person, and it changes every 2 hours. So this alone tells us that astrology is now inseparable from lived reality, because they can break it down to such an exact moment or in such an exact place. So at this point, astrology has all of the structural pieces that we now recognize today. The zodiac, the planets, angular points, houses, timing, but how these pieces are interpreted actually is still evolving. So now we meet one of the most influential figures of the entire history of astrology. We mentioned him in previous episodes. His name is Claudius Ptolemy. He is believed to have lived approximately year 90 to around 168 CE. He worked in Alexandria in ancient Egypt, which at the time was one of the greatest centers of learning in the ancient world. Alexandria housed a vast library containing texts from across the known world. Ptolemy had access to centuries of astronomical and astrological knowledge. His most influential astrological work is the Tetrabiblos. In this work, Ptolemy lays out astrology as a rational system, not fatalistic or chaotic, but more ordered. He argues that astrology does not cause events, instead, it describes tendencies, conditions, or climates of experience. Just as weather forecasts do not force rain to fall, astrology does not force events to occur, it describes the quality of time. One of Ptolemy's most enduring contributions is the 7 Ages of Life, sometimes called the 7 Ages of Man. Now, according to Ptolemy, human life unfolds in 7 stages, each governed by a planet, moving outward through the traditional Ptolemaic spheres. Now, these stages are not arbitrary. They correspond to planetary cycles and to observe change in human development. The first stage belongs to the moon, and it governs infancy from birth to roughly age 4. Now, the moon is quote-unquote moist, changeable, fast-growing, it waxes, it wanes, and Ptolemy associated this with the instability of early personality, rapid physical growth, and emotional responsiveness. Now, the second stage belonged to Mercury. Mercury governed childhood from about age 4 to 14. This is known as the period of learning, where language forms, intellect develops, the soul is shaped by education, and these are the traditional attributes of Mercury. Now, the second stage belonged to Venus. This stage spans adolescence to early young adulthood, and it's the age of passion, desire, attachment, and often emotional suffering. Because love brings pleasure, but it also brings pain, and both belong to planet Venus for that reason. Now, the fourth stage belonged to the Sun. This is the longest single stage of life, extending roughly from early adulthood to about age 42. The Sun governs ambition, visibility, the desire for glory or power, wealth, and recognition. In this period is where one seeks to be known. The fifth stage belongs to Mars. Mars governs struggle, effort, assertion, and sometimes violence. Ptolemy describes this as the stage where a person pushes to achieve before decline sets in. Decline that comes with age, that is. Now, there's an urgency here for that reason, a sense of your time running out during this stage. The sixth stage belonged to Jupiter. Jupiter represents withdrawal from ambition, so wisdom, judgment, and philosophical distance or detachment. Physical labor is renounced during this period, and foresight replaces drive. Now, the final stage belongs to Saturn. Saturn governs old age, cold, contraction, failing strength, silence. It's the stage where the body is expected to weaken, intellect slows, and life really begins to turn inward. Now, it's important to acknowledge something. Ptolemy describes these stages in explicitly masculine terms. So this reflects the cultural limitations of his time for sure. It doesn't mean that women didn't experience these stages. It just means that the language was incomplete, and that does matter. Now, what makes this doctrine especially interesting is that these ages do not match planetary orbital periods. So where did the numbers come from? Why was the period of Mars this length, and why did the final stage of Saturn have the duration of this amount of time? Well, Ptolemy really never offered a metaphysical explanation for that. Instead, later scholars point to a concept called apokatastasis. Apokatastasis means returning to original position. So in astronomy, it refers to the moment where a planet appears again against the same background of fixed stars. So these return cycles correspond closely to the durations that Ptolemy assigned each of these 7 stages. So time isn't linear, rather cyclical. And here astrology becomes unmistakably human. Life is no longer just events, it's development. It unfolds in rhythms just like the sky. Now this is where episode 3 closes. Astrology, as we now know it, has moved from watching to measuring, from measuring to meaning, and from meaning to the human body and the human lifespan. In the next episode, we're going to go even deeper, where astrology enters medicine, health, disease, and even healing. We'll talk about the 4 elements, the 4 humors, planetary qualities, zodiac rulership of the body, and why astrology was once essential to medical practice. I want you to pause after listening to this episode for a moment and just feel the shift that happened. Astrology didn't begin as personality traits or memes or even daily predictions. It began as humanity looking up and recognizing rhythm. First in the sky, then in the seasons, empires, and finally in the human life itself. By the time we reach Claudius Ptolemy in the 7 ages of life, astrology is no longer abstract. It's no longer distant. And it's not even just saved to be reserved for kings. It lives in the body, time. It lives in aging, desire, ambition, wisdom, and decline. So it tells a story about what it means to be human, moving through time. And that's the key idea I want you to carry forward. Astrology isn't about control, it is about context though. It doesn't tell you what will happen, it does tell you what kind of time you're living in when something happens, So in the next episode, as I mentioned, we will cross an important threshold where astrology moves fully into the body. I can't wait to be able to explore how planets were believed to influence health, why zodiac signs ruled specific organs, how the 4 humors shaped temperament and disease, and why astrology was once inseparable from medicine. This is where astrology becomes more practical, controversial as well, but powerful. And this is where timing meets healing, where the sky touches the flesh. If this episode expanded how you see astrology, I encourage you to sit with it and let it integrate into your mind and your daily life. And when you're ready, hopefully you can meet me in the next one. This has been Move with the Sky, hosted by Planet Jayy. Thank you for listening and for moving with the sky, not against it.